Welcome, Dr. J's Beckett Sports Card Insights. This is a ramblings episode with Rich. That needs no explanation. I've done this several times before. Rich and I just get on a roll and we go back and forth. Thanks sponsors, Topps Upper Deck, Panini, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Mike's Day Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. Not much to explain. It's just ramblings, and we had a good time. Hope you do too. Here it is. We got a short note from John Keating saying he was moving into type card collecting. And I think he's mainly baseball, but I think he has other stuff too. He mentioned he had more than 7,000 different type cards. And he wanted to know how that compared to things you and I had or had access to through all the nationals we went to and all the card library stuff that we put together. I'm guessing we had way more than 7,000. Again, certainly if you count more than baseball.
If you count more than baseball, definitely more than 7,000. Do you count parallels in the type cards, or are you just talking about a specific set?
Knowing him, I would say no. I don't think he's a serial number parallel, a different color, rainbow guy. I think he's moving aggressively toward vintage and more eclectic.
I think that's very smart for him. I wish he had been doing that when we were doing the almanacs, because he could have been an amazing contributor.
Exactly. He'd have been an amazing reason. He's smart. He's got a good eye. He understands the subject matter and all that. And even if he got it before we got it, we'd still maybe have access to it, to take a picture of it or to get it cataloged and all that stuff, because we were very aggressive. But it wasn't based on the numbers. And I don't remember in the almanac how many sets were in the almanac.
It was more than 7,000, but that includes parallels. But that was also pre a lot of the modern parallel explosion too. We had a lot of type card, and you were a type card collector. We also had stuff we did not catalog in the almanac. You and I were very good at finding stuff we didn't know. Let's put this away, and if we ever figure it out, we'll get it in eventually.
The other thing we didn't get in eventually, Krause did this for sure, and we resisted doing magazine cards. Sports Illustrated for Kids is the notable exception, had that strong branding behind it. But other magazine cards were not really considered legit. It was editorial matter, and it was recent. We didn't catalog them. You've asked me why did I resist doing that, because there's a fine line there in terms of what is legal of inserting a card-like element, binding it into a magazine is probably okay if you look back at what's happened, because they couldn't have enforced it on us and not on our competitors.
Everybody's agreed that SI for Kids is totally legit. The other thing with SI for Kids was there were a lot of athletes that were not famous at the time. They weren't just hobby-centric. They would have some really obscure people in the sports to feature, which gave them a cachet different than, we'll call it, Wall Street, where Wall Street was obviously hobby-based, and obviously the purpose of the Wall Street magazine was to sell cards.
What was hot at the time?
Where SI for Kids was not. Like ComC, the only thing of that group we take is the SI for Kids cards. To me, the line could be drawn with Krause Publications was a legitimate newsstand publication. They were a very legit editorial force. Chet Krause, who you knew, Chet was a legitimate publisher. They did magazines in all sorts of fields. So for them to do more in sports was okay, in my opinion. Now, we never put in magazine cards because I think, frankly, we were selling more magazines and didn't need the extra push. But also, as you pointed out, what do you put in? I think we finally put in magazine cards when we worked the deal out with Donruss Leaf Playoff to put sample cards into magazines for a year, which was a legitimate card manufacturer promoting their items in our magazines.
The other thing I am now realizing is that Krause was very ad-driven in their hobby publication, but they were dealer ad-driven, not manufacturer ad-driven. Our magazines, when we finally did take ads, most of our ad revenue was manufacturer. And so for us to do cards, which sort of is competing with the manufacturers, because we had a super design staff, we could have done some great cards. because our covers and the articles, the way things were designed, we had a great design team. But that could have jeopardized our ad revenue, whereas it wouldn't have jeopardized Krause's. They didn't have that to be considered. Plus the leagues and the players associations, I think they liked that we stayed in our lane. And our lane was to do what's good for the hobby, even though that maybe appeared to be low-hanging fruit. It was a little bit over the line of my comfort zone. Because we wouldn't have done like Sports Illustrated for Kids of pre-rookies and undiscovered people, but we could have legitimized it. All we had to do is have editorial content about the subjects. If you had a Ken Griffey card, you'd have a Ken Griffey article. If you had a Mia Hamm card, now what that would be doing in a baseball.
Married Gilmar Garcia Parra, so
okay, so she could go into baseball players' wives that play soccer. Okay, if you have a tie-in, I think you're good, but it seemed a little gratuitous. Then the other dilemma we would have had is if we would have put them in, quote unquote, our Beckett price guides with the Beckett cards. I still have people come up to me that were not that much in the hobby say, oh, yeah, you did the Beckett cards. And I felt like saying, no, actually, I didn't. But yeah,
we did do Beckett cards, but they were employee only.
I know. That's contraband for anybody that wasn't an employee. You still see a few of them out there, but not many.
I think we had a few people at the 93 picnic who had cards that were not employees because it was a little more open. So we had family members and a couple of friends. So there actually are some non-employees who have that.
Oh, for sure. No, we had that family picnic, Memorial Day, whatever it was. And I think it was 93 at the new building. Yeah.
And you're the only one I know with a complete set.
I have a complete set.
We didn't even know the full checklist. You had one.
I don't think they were numbered.
They weren't. We knew there were over 600 cards, but we didn't know how many.
You still see some of the sample cards that are legit cards with a subtle sample stamp, typically on the back, but occasionally on the front, sometimes in silver, more rarely in gold. I still have a few of those, but again, they're legit.
They're from the manufacturers.
Yeah. The other thing we were going to talk about is the donuts at the National.
Yes.
But that was Mark's idea. The donuts.
It was Mark's idea, and that 2000 National was the most explosive national. You and I were the last two people walking the floor for Beckett. Everybody else was either at the booth or doing something for grading because we did so well that we understaffed the grading area.
We didn't know.
We didn't know.
Too new. It's possible we did more than PSA did at that show. We were a new kid and we weren't staffed up for it.
And we also rolled out a lower price point.
Yeah.
I remember Mark talked about, I'm going to roll out a $20 price point instead of $25. Let's see, the Beckett name, a $20 price point, you'll get your cards back. Yeah, that sounds like a win to us. I remember we had 295 Jordans at that show, but that was really the show where I want to say Beckett dominated because not only did we do that, but Mark Harwell had the idea of feeding everybody donuts at the booth each morning.
He was carrying them around. They were delivering them in the morning from Krispy Kreme, dozens. So many dealers got a dozen donuts. And there were no heart attacks that I'm aware of from excess donut eating, but he had a pallet, seemed like, of donuts.
Every day.
Yeah.
That was money well spent.
He was a marketing guy, very self-taught, very intuitive marketing guy.
Self-taught, but he was a bodyguard because he was a big burly guy, but for the head of Hard Rock Cafe, I believe. Yeah. I don't want to say by studying him, but by listening and being there, he learned a lot intuitively about how to do business, which is something that doesn't always happen in life. Other people might listen and it'll go over their head. He listened to pay attention.
I understood the power of brand. Not that I want people to think of Krispy Kremes when they think of me or my last name, but it was a positive thing and they were fresh. When you go to Krispy Kreme, you don't want the day-old donuts. You want the ones that are just coming off the line. That was Anaheim, wasn't it?
Yes, that was Anaheim. And I have to tell this story. And I'm going to tell this with a laugh. I'm a good Jewish boy. I was still drafting fantasy rotisserie baseball until about 2002. I didn't look at a calendar, and the fantasy league I had been in, I was dropping out, but I was going to draft for this person because he was in Iowa. He couldn't come down. I made more money that year with the percent he gave me for really setting him up for the future. But it was the Saturday night of Passover. And you know what you're not supposed to eat on Passover is bread. We got done with the thing about 11:30. I'm having to drive back. I want to make sure I have some energy for the drive. And there's a Krispy Kreme donut, the last thing you should be eating on Passover, on the corner. Oh, that was the first time I'd ever had a Krispy Kreme donut that came right hot off the press.
It's the visual, but it's also the smell, Rich. They had you as soon as you walked in, where you were done for.
I was very much done for. We won the league that year. The other thing I wanted to talk about food is we were legendary when I first came to Beckett for our monthly and then I'll call it quarterly company lunches. I was not there when you started them. And I heard in the early days of the Beckett publication that it was okay after all the magazines got done. We all went out to Chili's for lunch or whatever to celebrate and say, hey, we got another magazine out the door. Yay. That's why I get a day to chill down a little before the next magazine. It eventually became a big thing in the new building with the big room called the social hall. And speakers would come in. Couldn't be cheap to feed everybody. What was the real purpose of doing that?
It's another step toward cross-training. You mentioned when it was all hands on deck for grading, that was meaningful because we had a family team atmosphere and people, especially the technical services guys, could grade cards. They weren't as fast or quite as good, but if you divvied up and give them the right cards, we could knock out a lot of cards. So I always believed in cross-training and people understanding the whole business. And like the customer service people would spend a day or two at Gervis's store just so you'd really understand the hobby. And the company lunches were a step in that direction. We had the smaller ones for new employees where I went out with the new employees that had come that month or whatever. And then the bigger ones, which sometimes were monthly, but sometimes were quarterly, were just everybody getting together. After a while, we had to enforce some integrated seating because we didn't want everybody to sit just with the people they work with all the time. Mixing it up was good. We had some really interesting people, Rich. And at that point, it was getting to be too many to know everybody unless there was an intentional effort, which I wanted to encourage. So I thought it was worth it.
Because not a lot of companies do things like that of any size. It's a fascinating concept.
How different is that than having Mavericks tickets or Cowboys tickets or Stars tickets? Or
it's different.
We had those too. And that was the same thing in the way that generally we had enough tickets that people could go with their friends and coworkers.
The Rangers especially. Because you have 81 games and I think we had 8 tickets. So that's enough for everybody.
Yeah.
Mavericks was 40 games a year and I think 4 tickets or 8 tickets. And that's hard to get everybody in. And the Stars tickets, I know I went for the first year to a lot of Stars games, but that was as much to get people more used to seeing hockey so we could actually understand the game to price cards better if we had to.
I had a discussion with the IRS about the business purpose of our tickets. I lost. I said, this is educational. They said, no, it's entertainment. I said, yeah, it's a little bit of entertainment, but it's a learning experience.
It really was a learning experience.
I'm saying, Rich, but the IRS agent said, you know what? I will be the laughing stock of the IRS if I let you get away with this. So I got a half write-off.
30 years later, with the reduction of the IRS staff, you would have been perfectly fine.
No one would have questioned it.
Nobody would have questioned it.
Except my accountant. And nowadays, if the accountant signs off on it, sometimes they can be liable or culpable if they pass through something.
I get the feeling Chuck would never sign off on anything that he thought would hurt him.
Chuck's retired.
Did he finally retire?
Yeah, he's older than me. He's entitled to retire. And he's fully retired now.
Good for Chuck. Chuck's a good guy.
His associate is doing a great job too. But I had a long personal relationship with Chuck, and it's sad. You shouldn't refrain from doing business with people older than you, because when you're young and they're older than you, they're wiser. And when you get old and they're older, they want to retire. And then you got to find somebody to carry on.
That happened to me too, where the person who was doing my taxes was a little older and he had been battling ill health and he passed on November of 23. And his wife is still running the business and there's somebody else who's doing the accounting. All I do is I hand her the forms instead of him. And the young lady does all the accounting.
While we're talking about the company lunches, I really think my vision for the company was looking out at a meeting room, a social gathering place where you can see everybody. Now, they were sitting at tables and stuff like that, but have one meeting that was real life, one room, Everybody's there. This is the company. If we wanted to have an intimate message of, hey, here's what's going on, that's why I think deep down, what's happened in the last 20 years since I've been gone, there's so much more offshoring, outsourcing, working from home, things like that. Those were rare exceptions for us. Anybody working not at a desk in the office, there were a couple of those I can think of. Working from home a day or two a week, some of the women who had small kids or pregnant or whatever, that we made accommodations. I think I had this sense of line of sight that I wanted to see and be seen, that we were a team, and I wanted to reinforce that every month or whenever we did that. So it was probably half social and half substantive. We'd occasionally have a speaker.
I can now speak as a fully remote employee. There's a lot of flexibility being fully remote. Having said that, there's also something about actually being in a place to do work and having on-site conversations with people of all levels, that you can walk into a door if there's somebody open and you really need to talk about something you don't get necessarily being remote. There are a lot of benefits to being remote too, or working at home as I'm doing now. I think for what you were doing in the 1990s, that made a lot more sense. Today, with the increased availability of the internet, being able to do a lot more teleconferencing easily, it's different now than it was 30 years ago. The world has evolved since that time.
I think really I was adapting. I could have adapted. I did adapt. But when I look back in hindsight, I think I was a better 20th century boss than I was 21st century boss. I carried over into the 21st century a few years, but my best years were in the 20th century. And I loved it. And those were simpler days. They were still complicated, still difficult. But I loved having the team where you could know everybody. And the company lunches were an expression of that. I think it was worth every penny.
Agree.